Michael Roytman. Welcome to the Let's Grab Coffee podcast. Good to see you, my friend.
Me as well. I feel like we've done this podcast a couple of times before. We're just doing it live now.
We have. What coffee do we have on hand?
I just walked over to Metric, which is just down the street from the Empirical office.
No, wait. I love Metric. That's for folks not in Chicago. I think it is one of the, if not the best rated coffee place. I know it's subjective. People have different ratings, but it is on the top list, right?
It is, and I might be biased because we used to compete a little bit, but I'm a huge fan of their work.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to your coffee business in a sec. But when you're not a coffee fanatic, for folks who don't know you, you're one of the most respected minds in cybersecurity data science. I'm going to lay up your intro real quick and we're going to get into it. You're born in East Germany, raised between Ukraine and Russia. You've immigrated to the US. You studied industrial engineering at UIUC, great school. You earned your master's in ops research at Georgia Tech. You spent basically your whole life building things, and that's from early command line programs on an IBM 5160. You built a food trucking app, to a Dharma Platform, which became a really critical tool for global humanitarian organizations like WHO, MSF, Save the Children, Habitat for Humanity, which when acquired was what got you the Forbes 30 under 30, awesome accolade. In cyber, you spent nearly a decade at Kenna Security, where you helped build really cool tools, which was then acquired by Cisco. You then become a distinguished engineer there for a little bit, and you now co-found and become the chief tech officer of Empirical Security, Chicago-based, a business that just raised $12 million in a seed round led by Castanoa Ventures. And you guys are building the first enterprise-specific AI models for cybersecurity. On the side, because you're not busy enough, you co-founded Sputnik Coffee, a Chicago roastery, bringing really high-quality, affordable coffee to working-class neighborhoods. You've become a good friend. You're a close resource, an advisor. So thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I forgot about most of those past lives. I just live in the present life of Empirical Security, but there is a past to all of us for sure.
Yeah, let me be the one to hype you up in the morning. That's part of my job on Let's Grab Coffee. I kind of wanted to start. You have a very interesting childhood where, you grew up in quite a turbulent environment between Russia and Ukraine. It's not an easy environment. It's a rough environment to grow up in. But I kind of want to ask, what did that environment do to influence you? Especially when you grew up in a family of engineers. Your father is a civil engineer. Your grandfather is a geophysicist. Very, very smart minds, of course, but very engineerial, focused minds. What was that childhood like?
Yeah, my mother's a physicist too. She taught high school physics. Yeah, those are not easy places to grow up, but I think I'm very fortunate that my parents shielded me from a lot of it. So growing up, I didn't feel any of that instability, but I did have the opportunity to go back to Ukraine with my father in 2018. And the Russian invasion had already started in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. And a lot of the folks there were as resourceful as you've probably seen on the news. I had a big realization there that a lot of that country's growth over the past 30 years and their path to democracy and freedom was laid by a lot of entrepreneurial folks there. There was a mindset and a culture of that. I think my father was a part of it too. He hustled in Ukraine, and I think you kind of had to survive out there, especially during Perestroika. So some of that is maybe a little bit genetic, the idea that you want to build things and be entrepreneurial and have a little more control over your outcomes. Some of it is the immigrant bias, as you all know. My past CEO, Kareem Tuba, he's now the CEO of LastPass, used to say that he really likes hiring ticks, tough immigrant kids. He immigrated from Syria to Oakland. And there's just a drive there where if you've made the move, if your parents have changed their lives for you, you kind of feel responsible for making it count.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that is, of course, that. And then the way that it expresses itself, I think, is what you see around you. So everybody in my life was very into math. My folks got me a Soviet math tutor early. As soon as we came here, it was what they did before, they bought an apartment or a house. They found me a Russian math tutor. And that essentially taught me the value of that education. I also liked it. Liking math is an interesting thing that happens to some kids and not others. It's almost like an affinity for languages.
Yeah, well, it's also, we spoke a little bit about this already, but this sort of sense of, immigrant guilt, the fact that when, you have this opportunity now, this access, especially to do something with it, right? That you got this ticket out, right? Sort of the Willy Wonka golden ticket out of the environment. And now you're dealt a better hand that you want to outperform, you want to go above and beyond and make something with this grateful opportunity that was presented to you. I'm sure that I had, a lot to do with it.
No, for sure. It also, I think makes me a bit of a patriot for America. I think that opportunity actually exists for everybody who's here. I'm just more acutely aware of it because of how my parents got here and me seeing them come up in America. But it's actually incredible that in the U.S., there is a lot of opportunity that maybe doesn't exist in other countries, or it's easier to access. Not to say there aren't structural imbalances here too, but they're much more difficult in some other environments for sure.
Curiosity seems to be a word that follows you around quite well. You're curious about math. You're curious now about cyber. You're curious about software codes. Where does that, I guess, habit, if you will, that mindset, was it because your parents helped give you access, whether it was to the tutor or your grandfather giving you an IBM 5160, back in the day? How did you get in the habit of becoming curious, especially as it relates to tech?
The habit of becoming curious is actually something really good. You should trademark.
Yeah.
I do think it's responsible for a lot of the things that have worked for me and a lot of the weird knowledge that I've gotten. I think there is a part of it where my childhood was full of people directing me to look at interesting things. Like my grandfather was a professor of geochemistry at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. And he was a guy who would like go climb rocks and look for rock samples and then analyze them back in the lab after going out into Siberia. So when the university gave him the computer, he didn't really want anything to do with it. He pointed my 5-year-old self at it and was like, here's a new toy, go play with it. Which of course, to a 5-year-old, a machine like that is like the coolest toy ever. So I started messing around with it. But, I think when curiosity is rewarded, it grows. And I was fortunate enough to have that. I think changing environments also makes you curious too. Like as an 8-year-old, my entire environment changed with the immigration. So one way to deal with it is to be like, hey, what's this about? What are these differences? How do I rationalize them? I also think some of it's genetic. Like I have a 1-year-old at home now, and he is insatiably curious, which makes me wonder if it's.
I wonder why.
Then anything other than it's innate. Although to be fair, kids are genuinely curious too, right? Everything's new to them.
Yeah. As a newfound father, congrats again on record. Beautiful milestone, of course. But as a newfound father, relative to what your parents and grandparents did for you, what do you envision doing for your kid? Maybe that's similar or different, especially as it relates to technology, because it's so fast evolving. We're in a different time. Curious your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, let's zoom out and just talk about as it relates to technology, because I think that question is interesting, and I think about like how will future generations interact with technology, and how do you prepare them for living in that world, right? Not necessarily working in that world. I think viewing technology as tools is really important rather than the environment or the end goal. You might have the goal of writing code or solving a problem, and then there's various forms of technology that come along with that. Kids now have the goal, all kids have this goal, right? They're social creatures, of communicating with each other. So they use Roblox and Fortnite and text each other and Snapchat and all these pathways that maybe we as elder millennials don't use. But it's important to remind yourself that they're really just tools for solving problems in their lives. And the problem in their life is socialization, right? And the problem in our lives might be doing business. So we use LinkedIn. The technologies themselves don't exist on their own. And I do think that when they do become an end in and of themselves, like you're just chatting with an AI or you're just doom scrolling, right? That becomes a problem. But trying to understand when you're using something as a tool versus being used by it is very important. I think that's just awareness, right? That's like stopping and thinking and being like, hey, what am I doing here? Have I just watched 14 hours of Netflix, or am I really trying to do something useful with my time?
Yeah, that's I kind of laughed. I don't know if you heard when you said the elder millennials.
Yeah.
Dude, I kid you not. My wife and I, the true story recently, we were in the elevator of our apartment building, and someone walked in, and he was on Snapchat. I couldn't help but, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop or eye drop, but the guy was standing basically in front of me, very easy to see the screen. And I just, speaking of like communicating over Snapchat, he was essentially, the way he was communicating with friends was just sending a picture of his shoes. Like he would just send pictures while he was standing up, the camera's pointed down. He would send that, and he sent that to like 10 people. And they were just going back and forth, like random pictures, which I know maybe saying this to, if someone's in the Gen Z category listening to this.
Well, maybe actually, it depends on the shoes, right?
I guess, yeah, maybe the context is shoes. I don't know. It was just, it was interesting. I don't know. We use Snapchat less and less. And it's funny, if you look at the older generation, they use Facebook more and more. So there are differences, of course. I think your core point, though, is being malleable.
Yeah.
Being flexible and leveraging curiosity so that when new tools are arising around you, to be native enough so that you're leveraging their benefit without being left behind. I think that's right to the average person who's not a technical person.
I mean, that applies to me and you as well, right? I think when we think about reskilling for what AI allows us to do, it's the same thing. Do you want to taking full advantage of the tool. You don't want to be left behind by not taking advantage of a new tool. At the same time, you don't want to let this thing do your job for you, right? That's also not the right solution. There's a happy medium.
What camp do you belong to when you hear, especially recently, the major headlines, right, of a lot of the hyperscalers, major tech companies, whatever people's perspective are on them. But recently, we're seeing a lot of this doomsday scenarios of massive layoffs and we're going to be replaced by and it's obviously coming up more and more. And it's starting to feel more vivid, especially now that people are starting to really realize how powerful these tools are and could be. What camp do you belong to? Are we going to be fully replaced? And if not, what does that scenario look like? What does that camp look like?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit of a contrarian. I don't think we'll be fully replaced. I'll tell you an example from Empirical Security.
Ireland took a big sigh.
Well, who knows if I'm right? That remains to be seen.
We just hope you're right. You know,
I think there's two things that are really clear in my mind as to why we won't be replaced by AIs. The first is that if I take a really short-term bet on engineering productivity, then for sure, engineers are getting a productivity boost from having access to, the code tools that are out there. But the engineers that are getting the biggest boost, at least in my experience, are really senior qualified people who've seen it all, can debug what the code is being put out. It's essentially saving them a lot of searching and querying, and maybe they can inspect the code and make architectural decisions themselves. I don't know if junior engineers are being assisted quite as much. So we at Empirical are hiring junior engineers, have hired a couple, and that's a very conscious strategic decision. I think some companies are, anticipating AI layoffs and productivity boosts that aren't doing that. I think they're wrong, because if you fast forward 3 to 5 years, what you really want is you want a team of people that's really good at solving problems. And I don't much care what way they solve those problems. Senior engineers will get code assist tools and get a little bit better, but those junior engineers are also just people that need to solve problems for customers and for the company. And whether they're writing that code with an LLM assist or they're writing that code themselves, the more important skill is identifying the problem, solving it correctly, and architecting it correctly, which I think those models are not very good at. That's a future prediction. That's not a summarization of an existing state. The act of creating something new, right, of solving a problem with a new approach, is the thing that we really try to curate and empower engineers to do. And I don't think that the AI revolution as it stands has a lot of that built into it. Now, that's one point, right? It's a longer term view on building teams that solve problems rather than thinking about engineering productivity in a one-to-one card-based way or point-based way or however it is that those systems think about. The other thing that's really clear to me is that, and this is part of my data science background, I was chief data scientist at Kenna Security for 10 years and spent a good amount of time just thinking about how these models function, and even attended classes of professional development classes at Stanford University about neural networks. Data really rules the world, even with the most sophisticated models. So unless the data that is being used in these models is constantly getting better at describing the world or constantly getting better at predicting the types of problems that we want to solve, I don't see a path for a lack of noise in the outputs of large language models. I actually think it is going to increase over time and make it harder to train models. Now, the technology that has created the AI revolution, the ability to train transformer models and to train models on the fly, is actually super exciting for many reasons. One of them being that the smaller the problem you're trying to solve with an AI, the better that machine learning model is at solving that problem. It's just that I am unconvinced that the general purpose AI will be replacing people anytime soon.
Back to, and I appreciate the context there, but just quickly on building, managing teams, I can sense someone who is in that predicament, i.e. growing a team, and wants to take your feedback in terms of, okay, we're going to assess problem solving capabilities. How do you and your team do that at an Empirical? How do you actually suss that out? Especially when people have so many tools at their disposal, that how do you know if it's coming from them or the tool, right?
Sure. That's an interesting point. That's just recent that folks are using kind of interview assist technologies. It's really interpersonal, right? It's how do you suss out that what you saw on LinkedIn about me is worthy of inviting me to a podcast? We had an in-person meeting and we chatted for a while and we did a roundtable together. It's the in-person interaction is really what allows for that, which I think means that interviewing has to go old school too. It has to be an in-person interaction at some point, or interactions between many individual people. We make that assessment. But to answer the larger question you're asking, which is problem-solving ability, I don't think this is anything new. 10 years ago, engineers were looking at Google and Stack Overflow for solving problems. And some were over reliant on it, and some were just using it as a tool, and you could figure out who was who. And maybe that's kind of where the 10X engineer came from. It's the people that can solve problems themselves and just use it as tools that you really want to nurture. I think the same is true in this environment. We don't have answers for it, but we are trying things. And one of the things we're trying is to empower engineers to not quite be their own product managers, but participate in the product process. So rather than here's a task, go do it, try to create an environment where here's a problem our customers have or a problem that the company has. How can we, that means leadership, design, engineering, come together and think about how to solve it so that engineering is involved at the beginning, at the start of the process, in the problem definition, in the problem solving process. That's not a natural thing for engineering organizations to do. I think it's easier if you're smaller or not that big. But I think one of the things that the LLM tooling has allowed is it's allowed folks who might not be that good operationally to now be amazing operationally. Like I'm terrible at taking meeting notes and AI takes that for me now. I'm terrible at searching what happened in those meetings or looking through Linear or Jira tickets to figure out what work has to be done this week. AIs are great at summarizing that information. So as an engineer who has to think about code and write some of it, which I'm not at this point, but I used to be at some point, the tactical product management operation type stuff that used to be essentially a different department, maybe AI can do it for me so I can focus on solving the problem. So if you think about that, what I'm saying is it's not that AI will replace engineers' ability to architect and write code and solve problems. It's rather it will help them just be better at executing those tasks and staying on task and knowing what the context is.
Got it. Right on. Let's sort of segue into your journey, being and also becoming a seasoned CTO or Chief Technology Officer.
Seasoned? Hold up.
Seasoned, man. Yes. You know what I mean? You got some,
salt and pepper at best.
Yeah, you got some wins under your belt. I mean, obviously as a CTO of several companies now, you've gotten to see the journey of building not just of different companies, but also different companies in different industries. And so curious, because I actually haven't had a lot of CTOs on the podcast, for folks who want to take a similar journey, what lessons have you learned on the rise of becoming a CTO?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm lucky to be in this position. I had really good examples from folks that I worked for, Jeff Hewer at Kenna Security, Ed Bellis at Kenna Security, who's my co-founder and CEO now, to see what it is that role does. But I think that in general, when you add chief to a role, that definition becomes a little amorphous and it really depends on the needs of the company. So one mindset shift is to not think about the role as I have this job, but to start thinking about it as I serve the company in the capacity that I do whatever needs to happen within these domains, right? Whether that's recruiting or evangelism or thinking about where the puck is going. The other thing I learned early on and was very lucky to have Larry Brilliant on my board at Dharma Platform. And he was an advisor to Mark Benioff and on the Salesforce board. He was an advisor to Steve Jobs early on. So I just asked him a lot of questions about how this works. And what he described is that there are different ways to be a CEO. There are different ways to be a CTO. And what you need to do is complement the things you're not great at with a great team that is great at those things, which is not that different than being a manager at any stage, right? I think you have similar things that you need to fill out in your role. So when I think about it being an executive role, then it's essentially how do I enable people that I work with to be really good at what they do. Part of that is making sure that you can see where the future is kind of going and enable them with new technologies or make them aware of new technologies, bring people in that you can. Part of it is just getting out of their way and letting them do the best work and have ownership of that work. The other thing is being unafraid to do any task that needs to be done, right? Whether it's boring form filling out and compliance forms or the actual heavy duty digging into something really specific and a specific issue. You can't be afraid to go really deep and do the task, and you can't be afraid to go really high up and do the task. And frankly, I don't think it was a very intentional thing on my part. I think I was just exposed to various parts of the business by joining early startups and seeing them grow. So I got to see the nitty gritty details and I got to see the larger picture because the executive team let me see it and brought me along on the journey.
What makes, just to drill down a little bit before we jump to kind of the companies that you actually built, what is required from a CTO versus someone who is on the technical team, but isn't, say, in leadership or management? And I'm asking more so from folks who may be in that world, in that scenario. They want to elevate, they want to start progressing in their careers, but they're struggling and they're unsure of, what advice would you give so that they can actually start making the climb up?
That's a good question. I mean, I remember from my time at Cisco, they had really strict criteria for what kind of promotes you to that role. And it was influence on the industry in some way, which probably means some public facing work. I think a lot of companies need the technology side of the house to be more public facing than ever before, because, the old adage is most companies are technology companies now, whether you're running a grocery store or an ad agency or some tech component there. But I think it is striking the balance between the strategic things that need to happen within the company and understanding them in the context of what's being built, right? It's different for a technology company to be a CTO, like me, versus to be a CTO at a company that isn't primarily a technology company, but has technological needs. Then you serve the business in a different way. And for me specifically, I think it's a lot of customer interaction, understanding the customer pain points, customer architectures, and the easiest way to solve those problems, and then trying to distill those back down to the folks actually doing the work and actually implementing the solutions to those problems. So it is always a combination of public facing and internal, these kinds of roles. But ultimately, you serve both the customers and the folks internally who are doing the building, and you try to smooth out the frictions that naturally happen between two teams that might not talk to each other all that much, building something.
Yeah, that's a good response. It's also, I felt this a lot when I was at a fintech startup previously. And I kind of saw, being on the business development side, I kind of saw the interaction between CTO, COO, product and project managers, and then everybody in between. And sometimes there could be a disconnect between the two, right? Technical team has boundaries that they're working with, timelines, right? They kind of see the realistic piece of the structure.
Right.
And then the operations and the business side really want to push, because sales, it's all about incentives too. We're incentive to push and whatever the client wants and just build it and we'll iterate. And then the tech team's like, all right, that sounds great, but we're on a cycle. There are things we might need more capital, more headcount.
You're bringing up a really good point. In general, businesses run through varying degrees of like tension and collusion in the departments. So like there's classically a sales engineering tension, right? Or like a product operations tension. I think if you really think about what it means to be successful in a C-level role, it is being aware of that tension and managing it. So trying to understand, can the business go ahead of its skis a little bit in this stage, or do we need to deliver operationally faster or more concretely on the roadmap? Those are the things that you kind of need to make a decision about, right? That's the executive part of it. But you also then need to bring everybody along, which means both the engineering team that you advocate for and then the rest of the leadership team, right? So talking to salespeople and trying to manage their expectations with the reality of what's happening within the organization from a technical standpoint is part of the translation layer that happens with a C that maybe doesn't happen when you're working as an individual contributor, which, by the way, I spent most of my career as an individual contributor, watching my current co-founder and CEO, when he was CTO, manage some of the technical deliverables that I would be doing and managing them towards the business.
It's not a bad idea too, I think, just as a general exercise for these different teams to spend some time with each other. I know a lot of people, folks, they say they want to, but I really mean, like, let's say if we worked at the same company, not a bad idea for me on the BD marketing sales side to come spend a week with you, like really spend it, and actually get a drill down of what you have to deal with, the stakeholder management you have to work around, and then flip the coin and basically you do the same with my role. I think you'll realize people will grow empathy really quickly for each other's roles.
Yeah.
And won't be as quick to be as hot-headed when things don't go right, because they also understand you're incentivized to achieve the objectives and goals that your personal role requires, in addition to that of the company. Everyone's also looking out for their individual needs in addition to the company needs and all the stakeholders that come around it. That's sort of the truth of just behavioral psychology, and I'm speaking generally for,
No, I think that's right. Right. People are on different edges of that spectrum, right? People,
yeah.
Some are more self-serving, some are more consensus building and serve the overall goal. But in general, we both have both of those needs. We all have both those needs. I think this actually brings up a really good point about how we do things. We have tried to be really intentional with that as we build Empirical as well. So we're a company that's probably half in Chicago, a little bit more than half remote, spread across the U.S., West Coast, East Coast, everything in between. One of our co-founders, Jay Jacobs, is in Minneapolis. So what we've done is we have quarterly on-sites in Chicago where everybody comes in and everybody talks about how we do things, because those conversations are really hard to have in not an in-person environment, right? How do we want to run the engineering team? How do we want to solve problems together? How is sales communicating to engineering? And then we spend another day talking about what we're doing. So planning for the next quarter, planning for what we need to deliver, thinking about what that means for the business, essentially breaking down some of the various that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And if you asked me 3-5 years ago, I don't know, 5 maybe is too long, but like during the pandemic when everything was very remote, I don't think I would have been able to answer what's the right way to run a hybrid remote company. I still don't think I know what the right way is, but this is what we're trying, and we like it. We think it works pretty well. At the same time, there's an overhead cost to it, right? Everybody's got to fly in 4 times a year, and you got to plan the whole thing, and it is what it is.
Yeah, but it's kind of like that saying, what kind of pain do you want to deal with? Right? Is it the short term or long term pain?
Yeah.
Because everything there's a cost. Like, what cost do you want to eat? Is it, the short term, the financial cost of having your team there, or is it the long term cost of not having a cohesive culture that then actually falls apart?
Yeah, I mean, look, you brought this up first, but if you want to talk behavioral psychology, the common thread throughout all this is a future bias.
Yeah,
it's not taking the short term win, but thinking longer term and trying to manage towards that longer term win. Both when you talk about my immigrant upbringing and what it is to be a CTO and how it is that you build a company, I think the common thread between them is trying to actively bias yourself towards what does this look like 6 to 12 months from now, and working towards that rather than what do I do in the moment.
Speaking of Empirical, let's start diving in a little bit on the business, and then I kind of want to go back to Dharma, because I think what you did there with especially touching humanitarian orgs was super special, and one that seems like a pivot from all the other businesses, but it's an example of how you can use technology for good and for social impact. So I'll come back to that. But speaking of Empirical, the company you're currently a co-founder, CTO of, you're fresh off of a $12 million seed round, some good notoriety in terms of a Chicago, growth company. So we're all rooting for you, basically. For folks who are not familiar, what does the business actually do? If you're explaining this to your grandparents, who are not geophysicists, by the way, this is the one point. This is, I think, the only person I've had to ask that question with adding a disclaimer.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah,
fair enough.
How would you explain Empirical? Go for it.
Yeah, by the way, that grandparent who's a geophysicist, he is 95 years old. And he's still around. He lives in Mount Prospect.
Oh, wow. God bless.
To be fair, I've tried to explain this to him, and he does not get it. Mostly because he
barely helps us all.
Yeah, well, he barely uses the internet. We are solving a signal-to-noise problem in cybersecurity. So for 20 years, cybersecurity has been really good at finding potential things that could go wrong that could lead to a breach. And at the beginning, cybersecurity is a pretty new industry. At the beginning, it used to be, I found this vulnerability in your machine, a hacker could take advantage of it, you should manage that. Or I found a misconfiguration in your cloud because of, some misconfiguration in your AWS cloud, somebody could get access to sensitive data. And it used to be a couple hundred and a couple thousand. Now the average enterprise sees millions of these potential findings per month and doesn't have the capacity to deal with them, largely because you need to pull an engineer off a project to solve it, or you need to spend time and money to address the issue. And essentially what you're doing there is you're placing a bunch of bets on what is really risky and what isn't. So what Empirical does is we build risk models. We essentially build likelihood models. Think of it as Moneyball, baseball Moneyball, for everything that could potentially happen in your environment based on all of the other data we know across a corporation. Your network, your laptops, your physical devices, your employee behavior, the network flow traffic into your office or into specific machines in a data center. Based on all of that data, can we train a model that can describe the likelihood of any one of these things becoming a breach event or losing you money? So we're essentially trying to moneyball how to most efficiently do the preventative side of cybersecurity by building machine learning models. And previous to the way that Empirical has done this, it was mostly, I wouldn't say it was a guessing game, but there were essentially kind of ad hoc manual rubrics. Sometimes people would fill out a scorecard and say, this looks important, you should go fix it. And over time, what's happened is most findings are higher critical. Most things are important, but in reality, they're not. In reality, actual breach events are super rare. They happen on 1/1000th of a percent of the time. It's just that when they do happen, they're really important. So we're in the business of predicting those events and trying to get them out of your environment before they happen.
How do you determine I guess I have two questions that came to mind right away, which is one, accuracy is obviously very important in what you're doing, and also working around the bias of, it's kind of like public markets. Past behavior or past trends don't dictate future. It doesn't guarantee what's going to happen in the future. So how do you work around that?
Yeah. So I hate to be that guy, but actually, it's not about accuracy. It's about precision. Here's why. If I am 99% accurate, I've got 100 machines that I have to take care of and make sure that they're safe. Mm-hmm. And for 99 of them, I did an amazing job and they're super secure. But one of them had a $100 million breach event, that I'm 99% accurate, but nobody cares because the business lost $100 million.
Instead, you were precise.
Right. Instead, what matters is precision. And actually, it's more than just precision, but precision is essentially, I told my engineering team to go fix 10 problems. What percentage of those problems were actually risky? Because if that team is fixing things that aren't risky, then they're missing the things that could become breach events or loss events to the business. So precision really matters. Precision by itself doesn't really get you anywhere either, because if today I go fix, I don't know if people have heard of the Log4j vulnerability, it was a big deal a little bit ago. If you go fix that one vulnerability that everybody knows is a big problem, you spend $200,000 remediating it, and you did prevent a loss event, and then you go home and do nothing for the rest of the year, then you're 100% precise. But you didn't reduce risk in your enterprise all that much. So there's a natural trade-off between precision and recall, or what we call efficiency and coverage. So efficiency is, I do 10 things, how many of them were efficient actions? Coverage is, of all the work that I did over the past month, over the past year, what percentage of the known risk have I removed from my environment? And now we're entering financial terms, right? This is like from the fintech world. This is essentially a risk measurement, trying to translate the very obscure technical language of security into a risk decision for the business. So we build models that allow folks to do that. We measure the performance of those models over time. We have a general purpose model, but we also build unique ones per organization, what we call local models. And that's kind of the core of the business at Empirical, is your environment is unique. Your risk tolerance is unique. The issues that you have to work on to reduce your probability of a breach event are also fairly unique. You might even have different threat actors. Like if I'm Lockheed Martin, folks are going after my patents. If I'm a bank, it might be financial theft that I care about. And so if I can build you an accurate representation of your trade-offs between your efficiency and coverage of the risk profile of each of these things that you have to do, then you as a person who runs a security business can make an informed, data-driven decision about what to work on next. And to answer your second question, which is how do you know, right? Past performance is an indicator. You keep measuring it over and over again. The beauty of the advances in data engineering and machine learning over the past 5 to 6 years is that we can now do these things in near real time. So things update hourly. We measure the efficiency and coverage charts for each business hourly and keep updating them. And if something's wrong, we go in and look at the model and try to figure out what's going on.
Well, thank you for that. Beautiful.
That wasn't exactly explained to me like I'm 5.
No, but it's distilled enough that I think most people, will get the gist. So thank you. It's not easy to also decipher. It's kind of like, I think Albert Einstein was the one who said that if you can't explain it simply enough, you don't understand it well. So it's a good exercise.
I mean, I think the simplest way I can explain it is essentially weather forecasts for cybersecurity.
Yeah.
We have an open model called the Exploit Prediction Scoring System that we publish to an organization called FIRST.org, the Forum of Incident Responders. So that's a weather forecast of what's the probability that an event happens on this vulnerability somewhere in the internet in the next 30 days. And that's something that Empirical maintains that's free and open to anybody. But then the local models are essentially localized forecasts. They're like, hey, what's the chance that my roof leaks and it's raining right now? That would be a really disastrous scenario for the business. And you could guess, you could check your roof all the time. You could rely on general purpose weather forecasts, or you could have something that's really purpose built for your business.
Admittedly, for all intents purposes, it's a startup, it's a growth company, right? Of course, you're off the backs of a capital raise. It's a very seasoned, experienced management team. But when you are going to companies, presumably you're using and leveraging and looking into a lot of their data.
Right.
The question I really want to ask, and this is for a lot of the startup founders in the room, even just investors, trust is a very critical component of that, especially when you're not as well of a known entity as a massive enterprise corporate business, right?
100%.
10,000 employees plus. How do you actually obtain that trust to be able to look under the hood and help these companies out when you're getting the lift off as we speak?
Right. this is something that my co-founders and I talked a lot about before starting the company of what is our trust strategy? Because I think you're identifying a very real problem that folks don't want to share their data with you, especially in cybersecurity, where that data is really sensitive. So what's the strategy for that? Well, one is we have an open source model, an open core model, the exploit prediction scoring system, which is data driven and free. So people use that and start to trust that process. About 130 vendors use the exploit prediction scoring system today as part of their product. So customers are familiar with it. Second is we have this global model, which actually doesn't require any customer data. We went and bought a bunch of data from different cybersecurity companies and trained our own model on that data. And that's a general purpose. What's the probability if something has an exploitation event right now, to the best of our knowledge? And we start our engagements with letting folks consume our data and building trust that what we're building is data-driven and solves the problem in the way that they're talking about. And then we ask them, hey, if you want to improve that, if you want to go further, then what we need is a way to look at your data and retrain the model using your data. I think that would be an impossible task in cybersecurity specifically if we said we're going to throw it into an LLM like OpenAI or Anthropic and fine-tune the model, because then they're sharing that data with a bunch of providers. Instead, what we're saying is the data can stay in your environment or it can go into our environment, but the model that we train is yours and yours alone. So part of that was that strategic choice of building individual local models that the business that we're selling into then owns. And I think that that is actually solving the pain point of how do you not share your data, but take advantage of the gains in machine learning and artificial intelligence for some of our customers. That's a pretty answer that I would give to a VC, and it also happens to be true. But the harsh reality of it is the problem that we're solving for them needs to be big enough where they are willing to try a new approach towards it. We really are selling a new approach to doing vulnerability management, application security, cloud security. And it, to try it is to trust the science, which thankfully a lot of the folks that have this problem are folks that have seen a lot of other gains from trusting the science.
In a weird, I don't know if this makes sense at all, but I'll say it. In a weird way, it sort of reminds me of, God forbid if someone has a very rare disease, a very unique medical outlier, emergency that has to be addressed, but there's not a lot of research behind it, but there's this new science or device that has come out that potentially looks, quite positive, that they're definitely willing to give it a try because their back's against the wall, the pain point is severe enough, and frankly, the incentive is they really, really want to live and have a long life. So,
well, I think the science of measuring whether it's working or not is much more established than it is in those cases, because you can almost instantaneously run a simulation of what the world looked like before in cybersecurity and after, because we're not dealing with people, right? We're dealing with devices. The data is already there. But I think you're right that when dealing with something that's malicious and really rare, you need targeted specific approaches that find that rare malicious thing. And so I think in a weird way, cybersecurity lends itself really well to machine learning approaches that are precision biased in the same way that healthcare does, in the sense that, the thing you're looking for is malicious and rare. So you have to build testing or build tools and software that can address that imbalance in the data sets.
Yeah, I love that. Let's, as we start nearing down, I kind of want to go back to, and congrats, by the way, on the success so far with Empirical, and definitely wish you continued success, especially growth in Chicago and across the US. So again, fully rooting for you, man. I think you guys will do a great job. You're going to crush, no doubt. You don't need me to say that.
Thank you.
I kind of wanted to, you got a cheerleader here. I did want to ask real quick about leveraging tech for good, because again, a lot of the doomsday sort of headlines, we talked about AI and the impact on headcount and employees and jobs. There's also the headline of tech for, malicious intent. And there isn't as much usually, in public headlines about how technology is being leveraged for good. So I kind of wanted to go back to your efforts with the Dharma Platform, what that even means. I literally had to look up what that actually meant, what it was about, why focus on humanitarian efforts, and why leverage your background and experience with technology for social impact. And is that even, possible to do more and more of for people listening? Like, should they integrate social impact with what they do on a day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I do think that cybersecurity has an outsized social impact, especially today when, a huge amount of folks are affected by the scam industry, the ransomware industry. Businesses and corporations bear those costs. So by building cybersecurity products, there is a social good component there. Essentially, you're securing the infrastructure for how we do business, building highways on the internet, which is primarily how we do business now. So I don't think of that as not a social good either. But I think when we think about what Dharma Platform was and what it did, and it was the brainchild of a lot of folks, I was part of that. We looked at problems that Doctors Without Borders in particular was having at the time. I think it was 2015, 2016 when we started, working in low resource settings. So places where there might not be connectivity or Wi-Fi or databases or cloud servers in the same way that exists today in the United States. By the way, it turns out that that also exists in places like Asheville, North Carolina and Texas during hurricanes and disasters where the resources kind of go away instantaneously. And you still need a way to do data-driven work. And try to come up with a solution for working offline, but also taking advantage of survey data, of medical records, of health records, of tally sheets. So if folks are interested, they should take a look at BAO Systems, which is continuing a lot of this work today. They're based in Washington, D.C. But the idea was essentially to look at vulnerable populations. So we worked in refugee camps in Iraq and during the Ebola outbreak, and be able to get accurate, timely data about what's happening on the ground in those settings without Wi-Fi. And the way that we would do that is we would build mesh networks between phones or iPads, deploy surveys onto them, and as the data was collected, essentially centralize it to one device and then send it back up to the cloud. There's many tools that do this today. The hardest part of it was essentially figuring out how to change the database schemas on the fly. So there was a technical component that was difficult. And then try to use that data to help guide decisions on the ground. So you can imagine humanitarian efforts without understanding the population are very difficult. Let's say you need to vaccinate against a potential virus, but you don't know how many people are exposed or what the family structure looks like, and you have to buy the vaccines and fly them somewhere. And sometimes they sit on the runway if you buy too much or you don't have enough. So this was essentially a logistics platform that worked in a particular setting that ended up being really helpful from that purpose. The TPG Rise Fund funded our Series A, and that fund was built for dual impact, right? For both building commercial businesses that had a social impact. And I think that still exists today. And I think when people think about it, the question you originally asked was, how do people think about it when they're going into business or building companies? Ultimately, what is social good and what is social enterprise is a value judgment that you make yourself about the business. And you steer the business into continually pushing towards that goal, but it's still a business, right? So you still need to make sure that it's operationally efficient and it makes sense. The Forbes 30 Under 30 award that I got, the social entrepreneurship one, still exists. It's been almost 10 years since I got it. But if you look at the past year's winners, you'll see a lot of what that work looks like today. I think increasingly these enterprises are now filling that gap. Like the one that I'll make a plug for is First Street, which measures the impact of climate change on businesses and corporations and individual homeowners. They build really sophisticated climate models of flood and fire and even earthquakes. And that to me is a very viable business, right? They're selling models that help the bottom lines of lots of businesses, but it also has a social component where they can predict flood levels and they can make people aware of risks before they actually occur and helps folks out and across the US and globally.
Yeah, really, really good insights there. So thanks for that, Michael. Especially, I feel like your thoughts about integration, I think, are more vivid now that I've spent almost an hour with you. I know we've had coffees in the past, but I think really getting deep into your story. And I remember when I first met you, one of my first thoughts about you, before hearing kind of all the technical components, was more so just how well-rounded you were. And it was more of a feeling like you kind of just came with a bit of a relaxed attitude, even though CTO, you're co-founding a company. It's in like the peak of busyness. And we talked about chess, we talked about life, we talked about parenthood, we talked about your love for coffee. So where I really want to end this conversation is the importance of being well-rounded, despite having a very, very busy, demanding role as your primary identity, and putting in the focus to make sure that that doesn't become your only identity.
I think I thought you were going to say the importance of coffee and real coffee, great coffee in your life. Man, heavy hitters from you always.
I know.
The identity question to close it out. No,
I didn't always on easy notes.
You're hitting the core of it, right? I think that I have been lucky to have a vast and varied amount of experiences, which if you listen to them and pull from them, helps you with the other parts of the business. Like I think My experience roasting coffee with the Sputnik guys for a couple of years helped inform my understanding of how consumer packaged goods work. And while that's not directly translatable to the business that I'm helping run now, it does help you think about financial plans and how you forecast quarter after quarter and what that depends on and what kind of analytics you can use. And having various applications of the same kind of problem-solving toolkit, which for me is data-driven decision-making, helps solidify it, helps you see edge cases. I think we all learn from all the different parts of our lives, right? It's silly to think that any of us are really specialists. We all have to make the coffee in the morning and do the dishes. And there's less lessons in that, but there's lessons in all the parts of our lives that come together.
Beautiful way to end. Michael Roytman, thank you, my friend. We finally did it. It was a smooth, almost 1 hour convo. And again, wish you the best. For folks in Chicago, make sure to connect, check out Michael on LinkedIn and what Empirical Security is doing in the cybersecurity space.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it.